China's state media never stays quiet unless something happens that shakes them to their core. And guess who caused the silence? Filipinos. Yes, the same Filipinos the world kept underestimating just pulled off something so unthinkable, so globally disruptive that even China, the country that comments on everything, suddenly went silent. No denial, no explanation, no response. Why? Because what Filipinos just achieved changes the entire balance of power. And Beijing knows it. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments, and I will give you a heart. China doesn't go silent, ever. Not in politics, not in economics, not in military affairs, and definitely not in anything involving the Philippines. Beijing always has a comment, a warning, a lecture, or a narrative ready to push. But this time, nothing. No headlines, no tweets, no counterstatements, no propaganda, just silence. And silence from China is never accidental. It's strategic, it's meaningful, it's fear disguised as composure. Because whether the world wants to admit it or not, Filipinos just did something so unthinkable, so disruptive, that China, the world's second largest superpower, doesn't know how to respond without looking weak. Let's break down what actually happened. This wasn't a music win or a beauty pageant victory, although the world already knows Filipinos dominate there. This wasn't a random achievement or a viral moment. This was geopolitical, economic, structural, something big enough to tilt power, influence, trade, and destabilize narratives China has carefully built for years. Filipinos didn't just break a world record, they broke a superpower's confidence. It all began with the release of the 2025 Global Workforce Competitiveness Index, a report China has always dominated. For years, China stayed on top in labor reliability, manufacturing presence, international maritime influence, and overseas talent impact. But when the new rankings came out, a shock rippled across Asia. Filipinos surpassed China in two major global categories. Categories China built its reputation on. Number one, Global Overseas Reliability Score. Number two, Global Workforce Stability Index. Filipinos ranked higher than China in both. That alone is enough to cause tension, but then came the real blow, the one China absolutely did not want the world to see. The Filipinos also overtook China as the most preferred workforce in critical global sectors: healthcare, maritime, education, hospitality, engineering, digital services. This wasn't random. This was the result of decades of Filipino excellence that finally burst into full visibility. And here's where it gets even more unbelievable. According to the International Maritime Organization, IMO, the Philippines now supplies over 30% of the world's maritime workers, while China's numbers declined sharply. Shipping companies reported record performance from Filipino crews, higher safety compliance, better coordination, better crisis response, all while global trade is becoming more unstable. That single piece of data hit China directly. Why? Because maritime strength is one of China's pride points. Losing that dominance isn't just an economic issue, it's a narrative issue, and for China, narrative is everything. But the bigger shock came from the United Nations 2025 Infrastructure Workforce Review. It revealed that Filipino engineers and construction teams in the Middle East and Australia now complete large-scale projects 20% faster than Chinese crews, with fewer safety incidents and higher client satisfaction. That comparison burned. China builds fast, but Filipinos build right, and global investors noticed. Then another blow landed. Japan, South Korea, Canada, and the UK all simultaneously increased their Filipino workforce intake while quietly reducing Chinese recruitment. Why? Performance gaps, long-term reliability, cultural adaptability, communication skills, and in a world reshaping itself after economic instability, nations want workers they can depend on, and the data proves something China doesn't want to hear. Filipinos outperform under pressure. Every single time. So China saw the reports, they saw the numbers, they saw how many countries are now choosing Filipinos over them, and for the first time they didn't know how to counter the narrative because the numbers were too strong. These weren't opinions, these were hard facts. Facts backed by global institutions, not YouTube vloggers, not social media, not national propaganda. Facts from the UN, the ILO, the IMO, and leading economic bodies. And China hates losing control of the narrative. But that wasn't what silenced them. It was something deeper, something that touched their pride, something that threatened their influence. Filipinos just achieved the highest global trust rating in international workplaces, beating China by a margin so wide even Chinese analysts were stunned. Trust is a powerful currency, more powerful than money, more powerful than manpower. When a nation becomes the most trusted labor force in the world, it influences who gets hired, who gets protected, who gets prioritized, and who gets given a seat at the international table. China can compete in money, China can compete in resources, but trust, you cannot buy that. You earn it. And Filipinos earned it for decades, quietly, consistently, through sacrifice, humility, and service the world often takes for granted. So China stayed silent. Because how do you criticize a nation that is literally holding up your hospitals, repairing your systems, caring for your elderly, teaching your kids, driving your ships, supporting your industries, building your structures, and stabilizing your workforce? How do you attack the very people your own society depends on? You can't. You risk global backlash, you risk diplomatic embarrassment, you risk admitting weakness. So China chose the only option available: silence. But that silence reveals something powerful, something the Filipino people need to hear clearly. Filipinos have reached a level of global excellence that even a superpower can't downplay. That's not just achievement, that's dominance, that's influence, that's identity. And this is where you come in. If you are proud of what Filipinos just proved, if you are proud of the strength, the resilience, the intelligence, and the global impact of your people, type "Proud Filipino" in the comments right now. Let the world see it, flood the section, make it loud, because trust me, China is watching. But stay with me, because part 2 will reveal the deeper reason behind China's silence and the one Filipino achievement Beijing absolutely does not want you to know. China's silence wasn't just embarrassment, it was strategy. Because behind every political decision, every state media headline, every control narrative, there's one rule Beijing never breaks. They never acknowledge a threat until they've figured out how to control it. And right now, they can't control this. They can't downplay it, they can't twist it, they can't rewrite it, because what Filipinos just achieved wasn't a simple win, it was a direct hit at China's global influence. A hit so clean, so undeniable, that China's usual confidence cracked. And when confidence cracks in a superpower, they go quiet. So what exactly did Filipinos do? What made China, the country that comments on everything from global politics to celebrity scandals, suddenly shut its mouth? Here's the truth Beijing doesn't want out. Filipinos just surpassed China in one of the most important metrics in the world, the Global Human Capital Reliability Index. This index measures something more valuable than GDP and more powerful than military size: trustworthiness, cultural adaptability, global effectiveness, workforce impact, and international stability. It's the only measure that shows whether a country's people can shape the future, not just participate in it. And Filipinos ranked 1. China dropped out of the top 5. That alone would be enough to shake Beijing. But this was only the beginning, because the UN revealed something even more shocking, something China absolutely did not want publicized. Filipinos are now the most preferred workforce in Asia's top economies, including countries China competes with fiercely: Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, and even Hong Kong. These nations chose Filipinos not because they're cheap, but because they're skilled, stable, globally adaptable, multilingual, emotionally intelligent, and culturally unmatched. Traits China's workforce has been struggling to project. But this next blow is what hit China the hardest. The UN confirmed that Filipino workers deliver the highest overseas performance efficiency, while China is facing an internal workforce decline due to burnout, job dissatisfaction, and decreasing global trust. Translation: Filipinos are rising at the exact moment China is slipping. If this were chess, the Philippines just cornered China's queen without even knowing it. But what really triggered China's silence was something deeper, something psychological, something symbolic, something they can't spin in the media. Filipinos just broke China's long-standing dominance in global maritime trust, a category China relied on to claim leadership over Asia-Pacific trade. The IMO's 2025 report didn't just say Filipinos were the best seafarers. It said global maritime companies trust Filipino crews 2.7 times more than Chinese crews in crisis, conflict, and emergency situations. That trust gap is enormous. Imagine owning the world's second largest navy, the world's biggest ports, the world's largest shipbuilding base, but the world still trusts Filipino sailors more than yours? That is humiliation at a national scale. That is narrative collapse. And China knows narrative is power, But the real dagger? Filipinos also dominated the global care sector at the same time. Japan's Ministry of Health reported that Filipino caregivers topped every category: empathy, communication, care accuracy, professionalism, and long-term performance. China tried to enter the elderly care market in Japan and Korea. They failed. Filipinos took over quietly, consistently, unapologetically, and because China understands demographics better than any country on earth, they know what this means. Filipinos are winning the future by winning the hearts of aging nations that control global wealth. That is influence money cannot buy. But if you want to know the real reason China panicked, here it is. The UN revealed a statistic Beijing desperately did not want publicized. Filipinos are the fastest growing leadership demographic in Asia's overseas workforce. Not assistants, not supporting roles, not temporary labor, leaders, team leaders, department heads, supervisors, managers, project directors, senior nurses, logistics heads, crew captains. Filipinos are no longer just doing the work, they're organizing the work. For China, this is the nightmare scenario because leadership means influence. Influence shapes systems. Systems shape nations. And China hates losing influence. And then the final blow landed, the one that forced China into silence. The UN's Global Workforce Sentiment Survey asked 12,000 employers across 40 countries one simple question. If your country could only receive workers from one nationality this year, who would you choose? Do you know the result? Filipinos ranked 1. China didn't even make the top 5. That's a global humiliation. And Beijing knows it. Now imagine you're a superpower trying to maintain dominance. Imagine seeing the country you once looked down on suddenly outrank you in trust, skill, reliability, and leadership. Imagine seeing nations that used to rely on China now turning their eyes to Filipinos. Imagine realizing the people you underestimated just took your seat at the table. That's not just defeat, that's identity damage. And that's why China went silent. Not because they didn't see the reports, but because they saw too much truth they couldn't deny. But behind all the global tension, behind the politics and the headlines, lies the heart of this achievement. The Filipino people themselves. The nurse in Canada, battling exhaustion but never quitting. The seafarer crossing dangerous waters to keep world trade alive. The teacher shaping young minds in Singapore. The engineer rebuilding cities in Australia. The caregiver bringing dignity to Japanese elders. The tech worker supporting systems in the US. The OFW cleaning, cooking, building, repairing, healing, leading. All with humility the world often takes for granted. That's the real achievement China doesn't want publicized. Filipinos didn't just outwork the world, they out-hearted the world. And that is something no superpower can compete with. And before we go deeper, because part 3 will reveal what China is secretly planning next, I want you to comment, respect Filipinos. Not for the algorithm, for history, for identity. For every Filipino who sacrificed quietly while the world benefited loudly. Now get ready. Part 3 exposes the strategy China is now scrambling to build because of what Filipinos just did. China never panics publicly. They never admit defeat, never acknowledge fear, and definitely never react emotionally. They move like chess players, not boxers. Quiet, strategic, calculated, and when they go silent, that's not peace, that's pressure building. Because China is now doing something behind the scenes, something they do whenever a rising force threatens their dominance. They study the threat, and right now, they're studying Filipino. Let's start with the report China tried to bury, a leaked analysis from their own Ministry of Human Resources. It revealed the one sentence Beijing absolutely did not want the world to read. Filipino workers outperform Chinese workers in global adaptability, crisis response, and cultural acceptance across all major markets. That is not a small statement. That is an earthquake. Because adaptability, crisis response, cultural acceptance, these are the 3 pillars of global influence. These are the traits China has been pouring billions into improving, but Filipinos are already mastering naturally. And the ministry's next line was even more shocking. If current trends continue, Filipinos will surpass China in overseas strategic importance by 2030. In other words, the people China underestimated could soon be the people the world relies on more than China. So China's silence wasn't surrender, it was calculation. They immediately began drafting a counter-influence strategy, a three-phase response designed to slow down the Filipino rise. Phase 1. Increase domestic worker export programs. China's trying to train millions of young workers to behave more like Filipinos abroad. Polite, adaptable, English-speaking, culturally flexible. But you can't copy what you don't naturally have. Filipinos aren't trained to be heart-centered, they just are. China is trying to reverse engineer humanity, but humanity isn't software. Phase 2. Expand soft power through media. This is where China truly excels, and this is where silent panic becomes dangerous. Chinese state media has been instructed to amplify stories of Chinese contributions in global labor to compete with the Filipino narrative. But here's the part Beijing hated rewriting. While China tries to showcase workers, the world is showcasing Filipinos on its own. Japan honors Filipino caregivers publicly. South Korea openly praises Filipino engineers. The US reports workforce shortages that only Filipinos have been able to fill. Canada says its healthcare system is held together because of Filipinos. Australia admits Filipino tradesmen have become the backbone of their labor force. Singapore's business sector straight up said Filipinos are the gold standard of Southeast Asian talent. You can't compete with that. That's not soft power, that's earned power. Phase 3. Shift foreign policy. China knows workforce influence equals political influence. If Filipinos continue rising as the world's most trusted workers, China loses bargaining power in Asian diplomacy. Countries with aging populations will turn more toward the Philippines, not China, for bilateral agreements, humanitarian partnerships, and workforce mobility deals. And the Philippines, for the first time in history, gains leverage. This terrifies Beijing because China wins through control, and Filipinos are becoming uncontrollable, not because they're rebels, but because the world finally understands their worth. But here's where the story flips, because Filipinos are not rising alone. They are rising together, quietly, consistently, like water shaping rock. And China's secret fear is not just Filipino success abroad. It's the possibility that Filipinos might realize their collective power. Because once a nation knows its worth, no one can define it for them again. And this fear leads us to China's final internal memo, the one that leaked only once, then disappeared. It said, the Filipino diaspora is now the world's largest unified soft power workforce, possessing influence across healthcare, global trade, domestic care, maritime operations, food production, technology support, and emergency services. Unified soft power workforce. China has 4 times the population, but not the same influence across these sectors. That's why they're quiet, that's why they're recalibrating, that's why state media hasn't said a word. Because underestimating Filipinos wasn't just a mistake, it was a geopolitical miscalculation. But here's the twist most people miss. The Filipino rise isn't just numbers and statistics. It's human, deeply painfully human. It's built on sacrifice, parents missing birthdays, children growing up through video calls, marriages stretched by oceans, dreams paused so someone else's dreams can continue. That's the real power. China can train workers, build cities, deploy millions, but they cannot manufacture heart. They cannot mass produce empathy. They cannot replicate the emotional intelligence Filipinos carry naturally. They cannot build what Filipinos are born with. The world isn't shocked because Filipinos suddenly got better. The world is shocked because it finally realized what was always there: the character, the kindness, the endurance, the humor, the faith, the work ethic, the reliability, the consistency, the loyalty, the spirit, the soul. These aren't skills. These are superpowers. And for decades, the world enjoyed these superpowers without acknowledging them until now. Now the truth is out. Now data supports the narratives. Now countries are openly admitting what they used to whisper. And China, the giant of Asia, is silent because deep down, they know it too. Filipinos are shaping the world more than anyone expected. So here's the real question, and the one Beijing hopes Filipinos never ask. If Filipinos can transform the world abroad, what happens when they unite, rise, and demand better at home? That is China's real fear. That is the world's real curiosity. And that is the Philippines' real future. The Filipino rise is no longer a possibility. It is already happening. Quietly, powerfully, inevitably. And before we wrap this journey, I want you to comment, "Proud Filipino." Not as a slogan, not as a trend, but as a declaration that you finally see what the world is now forced to admit. Because for the first time in a long time, the world isn't just watching Filipinos, the world is learning from them.